August 23rd, 1942. It was a Sunday afternoon in the city of Stalingrad. The sun was shining on the Volga River, a massive artery of water stretching a mile wide, carrying oil barges from the Caucasus to the factories of central Russia. To the casual observer, the city looked like a hive of industry. The tractor factories were humming, sending T-34s directly from the assembly line to the front. The civilians were going about their lives, believing that the war was still distant on the steppe. But at 4:00 p.m. the sky turned black. It wasn't a storm. It was the 4th Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe. 600 bombers, Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s, appeared in tight formation. They didn't target the factories or the military depots. Under orders from General Wolfram von Richthofen, they targeted the city itself. They dropped incendiary bombs, thousands of them, designed to turn the wooden housing blocks of the workers into firestorms. In a matter of hours, Stalingrad ceased to be a city and became a furnace. The asphalt on the streets boiled. The oil storage tanks on the riverbank ruptured, pouring burning fuel into the Volga, setting the very water on fire. 40,000 civilians died that afternoon. More than died during the entire London Blitz. The smell of burning flesh and melting rubber filled the air, a scent that veterans would later say never left the ruins. This was the opening note of the most horrific battle in human history. It was the moment when the German Wehrmacht, the master of precision maneuver warfare, stepped into a trap of its own making. They believed they had destroyed Stalingrad. In reality, they had just created the perfect defensive terrain for the Red Army. They had turned a city of wide boulevards into a jagged labyrinth of rubble where their tanks were useless and their infantry would be bled white. This story is not about machines. It is about the limits of human endurance. It is about the Rattenkrieg, the war of rats. It is the story of how a tactical shift, a river, and the sheer will to survive turned the tide of World War II. To understand why the Germans were so confident, we must look at the Sixth Army. Commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, this was the elite formation of the Wehrmacht. They had conquered France. They had smashed through Ukraine. They were the architects of the Blitzkrieg. Their doctrine relied on speed, radio communication, and combined arms. They expected to take Stalingrad in a week, secure the Volga, and cut off Stalin's oil supply. Paulus looked at his maps and saw a city stretching 20 miles along the riverbank. He assumed his panzers would roll down the streets, supported by Stuka dive bombers, and push the disorganized Soviets into the river. But as the first German units entered the suburbs, they noticed something disturbing. The resistance wasn't breaking. The Soviet soldiers, often cut off from their units, weren't surrendering. They were fighting from the basements, from the sewers, from the burnt-out husks of streetcars. Inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin realized that the fall of the city bearing his name would be a catastrophic blow to Soviet morale. On July 28th, he issued Order Number 227. It was a document of terrifying brutality. The opening line read, "Panic mongers and cowards must be liquidated on the spot." It became famous for its final 4 words, "Not one step back." This was not propaganda. Behind the regular Red Army troops, Stalin deployed NKVD blocking detachments. Their orders were simple: set up machine guns behind their own lines and shoot any soldier retreating without authorization. The Soviet soldier was trapped between the German hammer and the Soviet anvil. Death was in front of him, and death was behind him. The only space for life was in the ruins of the enemy. The command of the city's defense was given to General Vasily Chuikov. Chuikov was a man of violence, lacking the polish of other generals. He understood something that Paulus did not. He looked at the smoking ruins of Stalingrad and saw an opportunity. He realized that the German superiority lay in their artillery and air power. If the Soviet troops stayed in their trenches, the Stukas would obliterate them. So Chuikov devised a new tactic. He called it hugging the enemy. He ordered his troops to reduce the no-man's land to the distance of a grenade throw. The Soviet soldiers were ordered to dig their positions less than 50 meters from the German lines. This neutralized the Luftwaffe. German pilots couldn't bomb the Soviets without killing their own men. German artillery couldn't fire close support missions. The battle devolved from a clash of armies into a clash of squads. It became a knife fight in a phone booth. The strategic objectives shrank from capture the city to capture this room. One of the first focal points of this new intimate war was the grain elevator. It was a massive concrete structure, towering over the southern part of the city like a medieval fortress. It was defended by a handful of sailors and infantrymen of the 92nd Rifle Brigade. They had barely any food. They had no water. The concrete dust choked their lungs. For days, the German 94th Infantry Division threw everything they had at the grain elevator. Tanks fired point-blank into the silos. Stukas dropped 1,000-pound bombs on the roof. The concrete cracked and burned, but the firing from the windows never stopped. The defenders fought until they ran out of ammunition. Then they fought with knives and rocks. A German officer wrote in his diary, "If all the buildings in Stalingrad are defended like this one, none of our soldiers will return to Germany." When the Germans finally captured the smoking shell of the elevator, they found only a few dozen bodies. They couldn't understand how so few men had held up an entire division, but the grain elevator was just the beginning. To the north, the Mamayev Kurgan, a Tatar burial mound offering a view over the entire city and the crucial river crossings, was becoming the bloodiest hill in history. It changed hands 14 times. The soil was so churned by artillery that in the spring of 1943 grass would not grow there. It remained black. The savagery of the fighting stripped away the veneer of civilization. In the cellars, civilians who hadn't managed to cross the river huddled in starvation. Mothers boiled leather belts to make soup for their children. The noise was constant, a cacophony of screeching rockets, known as Stalin's organs, and the tearing sound of the German MG-42s. But the lifeline of the city was the Volga River. Every night, under the cover of darkness, a flotilla of tugboats, barges, and fishing skiffs crossed the mile-wide river from the east bank. They brought ammunition, vodka, and fresh meat, new conscripts, to feed the grinder. And every return trip, they brought back the wounded. The Germans knew this. The Luftwaffe kept the river under constant illumination with flares. They strafed the barges mercilessly. The water of the Volga turned red. Yet, the Volga flotilla never stopped. If the river crossing failed, the city died. By mid-September, the Germans had pushed the Soviets back to a thin strip of land along the riverbank, sometimes only a few hundred yards deep. Paulus could see the river. He could almost touch victory, but every time he tried to close his hand, he grasped only jagged steel and defiance. He was losing thousands of men a day to take piles of broken bricks. He didn't know it yet, but he was no longer the attacker. He was the prisoner of the city. The War of Rats had begun, and the Germans were not adapted to this environment. They were methodical, clean, and rigid. Their enemy was improvisational, desperate, and at home in the dirt. As the first frosts of October began to appear on the rubble, a new sound began to terrorize the German officers. It wasn't an explosion, it was the single sharp crack of a Mosin Nagant rifle. The snipers were coming out to hunt. By October 1942, the German Sixth Army had captured 90% of Stalingrad, but percentages meant nothing in a city where a single pile of bricks could hold up a regiment for 3 days. The front lines were no longer drawn on maps with bold arrows. They were drawn through the middle of living rooms. It was common for the Germans to occupy the 3rd floor of a building, while the Soviets held the 2nd floor, and the Germans held the basement. They would shoot at each other through holes blasted in the ceilings. They would roll grenades down the stairwells like bowling balls. Sleep became impossible. The distinction between day and night vanished, replaced only by the constant flickering light of flares and burning magnesium. In this chaotic environment, the Soviet defenders evolved. They realized that mass charges were suicide. Instead, they began to wage a war of silence and terror. The rubble of the tractor factory and the Barricadi gun factory provided the perfect hunting ground for a new breed of soldier, the sniper. The most famous of these was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Ural Mountains who had learned to shoot wolves as a child. Zaitsev wasn't just a marksman, he was a tactician. He realized that in the urban jungle, patience was more lethal than firepower. He would lie motionless under a sheet of corrugated iron for 16 hours, urinating in his pants, waiting for a German officer to show his head for 2 seconds. But Zaitsev's true contribution wasn't his kill count, which officially stood at 225. His contribution was industrial. He set up a sniper school in the ruins of the Lazur chemical plant. He taught the hare tactics, using a helmet on a stick to draw German fire while a second sniper spotted the muzzle flash. He trained factory workers, telegraph operators, and even kitchen staff to become invisible killers. The psychological impact on the Germans was devastating. A German soldier could not walk to the latrine without fear. Officers removed their rank insignias to avoid being targeted. The constant fear of the invisible bullet drained the Wehrmacht's morale faster than the lack of food. They called it the Russian sickness, the feeling of being watched by the ruins themselves. While the snipers controlled the open spaces, the battle for the buildings was defined by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. In late September, Pavlov and a platoon of just a few dozen men seized a 4-story apartment building overlooking a strategic square in the city center. It was codenamed the Lighthouse, but history would know it as Pavlov's house. For 58 days, Pavlov and his men held this single building against entire German divisions. They didn't just hide, they turned the apartment block into a fortress of medieval ingenuity. They knocked holes in the party walls, so they could run from one end of the building to the other without exposing themselves. They mined the approaches with anti-personnel explosives. They set up heavy machine guns in the basement windows, creating a kill zone at ankle height. Most brilliantly, Pavlov dragged a PTRD anti-tank rifle all the way to the roof. The PTRD was a massive single-shot weapon that fired a 14.5mm armor-piercing bullet. From the roof, Pavlov could fire down onto the top armor of German panzers approaching the square. The tanks couldn't elevate their main guns high enough to hit him on the roof. He was untouchable. German maps of the city marked the apartment building simply as Festung, fortress. Paulus lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than the German army lost taking the city of Paris. The building became a symbol of the Soviet refusal to die. Even civilians stayed in the basement throughout the siege, helping the soldiers reload magazines and tend to the wounded, living in a darkness that smelled of cordite and unwashed bodies. General Chuikov, observing the success of these small unit actions, formalized a new doctrine. He realized the cumbersome German infantry squads, armed with bolt-action Kar-98K rifles and relying on heavy machine gun support, were ill-suited for clearing rooms. The German rifle was too long to swing around a corner in a narrow hallway. The machine gun took too long to set up. Chuikov created storm groups. These were small, agile teams of 6 to 8 men. They were armed with the PPSH-41 submachine gun, a weapon that sprayed 71 rounds of pistol ammunition in seconds, essentially a flamethrower of lead. They carried sacks of grenades, and crucially, they carried sharpened entrenching tools, spades. In the brutal intimacy of close-quarters combat, the sharpened spade was more effective than a bayonet. It could be used to hack, slash, and parry in the dark confines of a stairwell. The storm groups developed a brutal rhythm: kick the door, throw a grenade, wait for the boom, rush in firing the PPSH from the hip, finish the survivors with the spade, move to the next room, repeat. They cleared buildings floor by floor, room by room, leaving nothing but silence behind them. But as the surface became too deadly, the war moved underground. Stalingrad had a complex network of storm drains and sewers large enough for a man to walk through. The Germans called it the canalization. It became a terrifying subterranean front. Soviet troops would use the sewers to pop up behind German lines, slit throats, and disappear back into the darkness. The Germans responded by sending their own pioneer troops into the tunnels armed with flamethrowers. The fighting in the sewers was primal. The air was thick with methane gas and the stench of decomposing bodies that had washed into the drains. A flamethrower burst in a confined tunnel didn't just burn, it sucked all the oxygen out of the air, suffocating everyone in the vicinity. Men fought in pitch blackness, grappling in the sewage water, dying miles from the sun. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army was exhausted. They had reached the Volga in several places. They had split the Soviet defenders into small, isolated pockets. On the map, it looked like they had won, but the soldiers knew better. The letters found on dead German soldiers from this period reveal a haunting shift in psychology. In August, they wrote of victory and returning home for Christmas. By November, the tone was one of fatalism. One soldier wrote to his wife, "We have fought for 15 days for a single factory. We have conquered the kitchen, but there is still the living room. At this rate, we will capture the factory in a month, but we will all be dead." Stalingrad is no longer a city. It is a mass grave. The German supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The winter clothing hadn't arrived. The ammunition was rationed. The horses that pulled the artillery were beginning to starve, and the soldiers were beginning to eye the horses as food. And while the Germans were fixated on the last 100 yards of rubble in front of them, they were blind to what was happening on the horizon. Far to the northwest and far to the south, out on the frozen steppe, the war forge of the Soviet Union had been busy. Marshal General Chuikov had been gathering a massive reserve army. He had moved 1 million men, 900 T-34 tanks, and 13,000 artillery pieces into position at night, under strict radio silence. The Germans thought the Red Army was broken, bleeding to death in the ruins. They didn't know that the troops in the city were just the bait. The trap was set. The jaws were about to snap shut. And the name of the executioner was Operation Uranus. While the soldiers of the Sixth Army were bleeding for every inch of rubble inside Stalingrad, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding 70 miles to the west, out on the open, wind-swept steppe. General Paulus had committed his best German units to the meat grinder of the city. To protect his flanks, the rear of his army, he relied on his allies, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies. These men were brave, but they were not equipped for this war. They wore thin summer tunics in temperatures that had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. They had virtually no heavy anti-tank guns. They were relying on horse-drawn 37mm cannons, weapons so obsolete the Germans called them door-knockers, because they merely scratched the paint of Soviet tanks. The Romanian commanders had sent frantic warnings to German headquarters. They reported the sound of thousands of tank engines revving in the night on the Soviet side of the lines. They reported massive movements of men. Paulus ignored them. German intelligence, blinded by arrogance, believed the Red Army was exhausted, incapable of a large-scale offensive. They believed the Untermensch, subhumans, lacked the logistical capacity to launch a complex pincer movement. At 7:20 a.m. on November 19, 1942, the German arrogance died in a thunderstorm of artillery. Marshal Zhukov unleashed Operation Uranus. 3,500 Soviet guns and mortars opened fire simultaneously. The fog was so thick that visibility was less than 50 yards, but the roar was unmistakable. Then came the tanks. The T-34s, painted white to match the snow, surged out of the mist. The Romanian front didn't just break, it evaporated. Without anti-tank weapons, the Romanian infantry had two choices: be crushed under the tracks or run. They ran. Panic spread like wildfire. The Soviet armored columns drove deep into the German rear, advancing 50 miles in a single day, destroying supply depots, airfields, and command posts. 4 days later, on November 23rd, near the town of Kalash, the two arms of the Soviet pincer met. Soviet tank crews from the north shook hands with crews from the south. They jumped on their hulls, cheering, drinking vodka, and firing flares into the sky. The trap was shut. Inside the ring of steel, the entire German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, along with thousands of horses, tanks, and artillery pieces, was cut off from the world. They were trapped in what the Germans called der Kessel, the cauldron. Inside his headquarters, General Paulus was paralyzed. His subordinate commanders begged him to turn around and break out immediately. The Soviet ring was still thin. If the Sixth Army gathered its panzers and punched westward, they could escape, abandoning the city but saving the men. Paulus radioed Hitler for permission to retreat. Hitler's response was swift and absolute. The Sixth Army will hold its positions to the last man and the last round. There will be no retreat. Stalingrad is a fortress. Hitler was gambling on a miracle, and the architect of that false miracle was the head of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring, a morphine-addicted political maneuverer who had lost touch with reality, assured Hitler, "My Luftwaffe can supply the Sixth Army by air. We did it at Demyansk. We can do it again. The army can hold out until spring." It was a lie of criminal proportions. The logistics staff of the Luftwaffe did the math. To keep 300,000 fighting men alive, to provide just bread, fuel, and ammunition, the Sixth Army needed a minimum of 500 tons of supplies per day. To deliver 500 tons, the Luftwaffe needed 800 serviceable Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, flying every single day. They had fewer than 100 serviceable planes in the sector. The airlift began in December, and it was a disaster from day one. The weather was atrocious. Blizzards grounded the planes for days at a time. The Soviet anti-aircraft batteries ringing the Kessel shot the slow, lumbering Ju-52s out of the sky by the dozen. The approaches to the Pitomnik and Gumrak airfields inside the pocket became graveyards of burning aluminum. On a good day, the Luftwaffe delivered 100 tons. On bad days, 0. The average was barely 80 tons, less than 20% of the minimum required for survival. Worse, the Warforge of Germany was failing in its coordination. The starving soldiers inside the pocket would run to the landing planes, desperate for food, only to find crates filled with useless items. One plane arrived filled with thousands of right-footed boots. Another arrived filled with medals and propaganda leaflets. Another crate contained tons of spices, marjoram and pepper, for an army that had no meat to cook. One famous shipment contained 200,000 contraceptives for dying men who hadn't seen a woman in months. Inside the Kessel, civilization collapsed. The ration was cut to 100 grams of bread a day, a thin slice of stale dough mixed with sawdust, then 50 grams, then nothing. The horses were eaten first, then the dogs. Then reports of cannibalism began to surface in the darker corners of the basements. The cold was relentless. Without fuel for the bunkers, men huddled together for warmth. If a soldier fell asleep in the snow, he never woke up. The frozen meat medal, the ribbon for the winter campaign, became a grim joke. But the most terrifying aspect was the psychological isolation. The mail service was the only link to the outside world. The last planes out carried sacks of letters. German censors reading these letters saw the transformation of the human soul. In November, the letters expressed confidence. The Führer will get us out. In December, they expressed confusion. Why haven't the panzers come? Are we forgotten? By Christmas 1942, they expressed only farewells. One soldier wrote, "We are the living dead. Do not weep for me. I am already a ghost. We have been sacrificed on the altar of a map." On Christmas Eve, the soldiers of the Sixth Army tuned their radios to the German broadcast. They heard Joseph Goebbels speaking from Berlin, claiming that the troops in Stalingrad were celebrating in warm bunkers, singing carols, fully supplied. The men in the ruins, gnawing on frozen horse bones, listening to the lie, finally understood the truth. No relief army was coming. Manstein's rescue attempt, Operation Winter Storm, had stalled 30 miles away and been forced to turn back. They were alone. As January 1943 arrived, the Soviet ring tightened. General Rokossovsky offered Paulus an honorable surrender. He promised food and medical care for the prisoners. Paulus refused, citing his oath to Hitler. So, the Red Army unleashed Operation Ring. It was the final crushing of the pocket. The Soviets didn't need tactics anymore. They had overwhelming artillery superiority. They simply rolled forward, blasting every bunker, every cellar, every ruin into dust. The Kessel shrank. The airfields were overrun. The last Ju-52 took off under mortar fire, carrying wounded officers clinging to the wings until they fell off from the cold. The German Sixth Army, the conqueror of Europe, was now a huddled mass of starving skeletons trapped in the basement of a department store. January 30th, 1943. The 10th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. In Berlin, the Nazi hierarchy was preparing speeches celebrating a decade of the Third Reich. But in the basement of the Uniwehrmacht department store in the center of Stalingrad, there was nothing to celebrate. Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, sat on a camp bed in a small, windowless concrete room. The air was foul, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, gangrene, and stale tobacco smoke. Above him, the ceiling shook rhythmically as Soviet tanks blasted the ruins of the building point blank. Paulus was a broken man. He had lost 30 pounds. His face was twitching with a nervous tic. He knew the end was measured in hours. Then a radio message arrived from Berlin. It was a personal communiqué from the Führer. It listed dozens of promotions for the officers trapped in the pocket. At the very end of the message was a specific note for Paulus: "I promote you to the rank of General Feldmarschall." Paulus stared at the paper. In the entire history of the Prussian and German military, no field marshal had ever been captured alive. The promotion was not a reward, it was an order. Hitler was handing Paulus a pistol and telling him to commit suicide. He wanted Paulus to die a martyr, a Wagnerian hero who chose death over dishonor, so that Goebbels could use his sacrifice in propaganda broadcasts. Paulus looked at his aides and reportedly said, "I have no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal." It was the final act of defiance from a man who had obeyed every disastrous order for 5 months. He would not give Hitler his dead hero. The next morning, January 31st, 1943, the firing outside the Univermag store suddenly stopped. The silence was louder than the explosions. A young Soviet lieutenant named Fyodor Yelchenko, accompanied by a few soldiers armed with PPSH submachine guns, kicked open the doors of the basement. They walked down the dark, rubble-strewn stairs, wary of traps. What they found shocked them. The German headquarters staff were not fighting to the last bullet. They were packing their bags. They were burning documents. Yelchenko entered Paulus's room. The new field marshal was lying on the bed, staring at the wall. He stood up slowly. He was wearing his impeccable dress uniform, clean and pressed, a stark contrast to the filth and misery of the starving soldiers dying in the corridors outside. Paulus surrendered his personal weapon. The Battle of Stalingrad for him was over. He was led out into the blinding winter sunlight, pushed into a captured car and driven away. But the horror was just beginning for his men. While Paulus was driven to a heated Dachau for interrogation, the 91,000 surviving German soldiers were rounded up. They were a ghostly army. Most were suffering from frostbite, turning their toes and fingers black. Almost all had dysentery. They were covered in lice, hordes of them swarming in their rags, carrying typhus. They were ordered to march. The March of the Bones led from the ruins of the city out into the frozen steppe, toward temporary prison camps like Beketovka. It was a march of death. The Soviet guards were brutal, but they were also exhausted and angry. They had seen their own city destroyed. They had little food for themselves and even less for the invaders. If a German prisoner stumbled or fell behind, he was shot instantly. If he stopped to drink from a puddle, he was shot. The road to the camps was lined with frozen corpses, stacked like cordwood in the snow. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered in February 1943, nearly half died within the first few weeks of captivity. Typhus swept through the camps, killing thousands a day. The ground was too frozen to dig graves, so the bodies were piled in ravines and covered with snow until the spring thaw. Back in Germany, the Nazi regime could not hide the disaster forever, but they could lie about it. On February 3rd, the German radio interrupted its regular programming. The announcer spoke in a solemn, funereal voice. From the Führer's headquarters, it is announced: the Battle of Stalingrad has ended. True to its oath to the last breath, the Sixth Army, under the exemplary leadership of Field Marshal Paulus, has been overwhelmed by the superiority of the enemy and the unfavorable course of our circumstances. They played the slow movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The broadcast claimed that the soldiers had died fighting to the last man. It claimed they died so that Germany might live. They did not mention the surrender. They did not mention the 91,000 prisoners marching into the void. To the German public, their sons, husbands, and fathers were dead heroes, not starving captives. But the truth filtered back. It came in the form of missing letters. It came from the whispers of soldiers on leave. And for the first time since the war began, a shadow of doubt fell over the German population. The myth of invincibility was shattered. If the Great Sixth Army could be destroyed, could Germany actually lose the war? In Moscow, the mood was ecstatic. The bells of the Kremlin rang out. It was the turning point. For the first time, the Red Army had not just stopped the Wehrmacht. They had annihilated an entire army group. They had captured 22 generals, They had seized enough equipment to outfit a whole new army. Stalin was vindicated. The war of rats had been won not by brilliant maneuvering, but by stubbornness, by the willingness to endure more suffering than the enemy. However, the human cost of this victory remains one of the darkest statistics in history. The total casualties for the Battle of Stalingrad, including Germans, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, and Soviets, military and civilian, are estimated at nearly 2 million people. In 5 months in one city, humanity lost more lives than the United States lost in all its wars combined, from the Revolution to Afghanistan. And for the survivors of the Sixth Army, the war was far from over. Their ordeal in the Soviet gulags would last for more than a decade. Years passed. The war ended. Hitler committed suicide. Germany was divided. The world changed. And still, the mothers and wives in Germany waited. In 1955, 12 years after the surrender, the final trainload of prisoners returned from the Soviet Union to West Germany. Crowds gathered at the station, holding photos of young men who would now be in their 30s. Of the 91,000 who marched out of the ruins of Stalingrad, only 5,000 stepped off the train. The rest lay in the frozen earth of Russia, victims of a hubris that believed a map was more important than a life. February 2nd, 1943. The guns finally went silent. For the first time in 163 days, the air over the Volga was not filled with the screech of Stuka sirens or the roar of artillery. The silence was unnerving. It rang in the ears of the survivors like a physical weight. But as the adrenaline faded, a new horror emerged. Spring was coming to the steppe. The temperatures began to rise. The snow that had blanketed the city for months began to melt. And as the white covering receded, it revealed the cost of the battle. The city was literally paved with dead bodies. In the cellars, in the streets, under the collapsed walls lay the remains of nearly 2 million people. The smell of decomposition became so overpowering that pilots flying thousands of feet above the city reported being able to smell death in their cockpits. The Soviet authorities faced a sanitary crisis of biblical proportions. Before the city could be rebuilt, it had to be cleaned. Special brigades, often made up of German prisoners who hadn't yet been marched east, were tasked with stacking the corpses. They found bodies still locked in hand-to-hand combat, frozen in the moment of mutual destruction. They found hills, like the Mamayev Kurgan, where the concentration of metal was so high, thousands of shell fragments per square meter, that magnetic mine detectors were useless. The metal had to be picked out by hand. While the cleanup began in the mud, the significance of the victory was being celebrated in the halls of power. In November 1943, at the Tehran Conference, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met to decide the future of the war. In a rare moment of genuine emotion, Winston Churchill stood up and presented a gift to Stalin. It was a magnificent two-handed longsword, forged by the finest craftsmen in England. Its blade was engraved with the words, "To the steel-hearted citizens of Stalingrad, the gift of King George VI in token of the homage of the British people." When Stalin took the sword, he kissed the scabbard. He handed it to Roosevelt, who held it up and said, "Truly they had hearts of steel." It was the ultimate recognition. The Western world, which had often looked down on the Soviet military as clumsy and primitive, acknowledged that the war of rats had saved civilization. The backbone of the Wehrmacht had been snapped on the banks of the Volga. Today, if you visit Volgograd, the modern name for Stalingrad, the skyline is dominated by a shadow. On top of the blood-soaked hill of Mamayev Kurgan stands The Motherland Calls. It is a statue of a woman stepping forward with a raised sword, screaming a battle cry to her sons. She is 85 meters tall, nearly twice the size of the Statue of Liberty, excluding the pedestal. She weighs 8,000 tons. The engineering behind this statue tells the story of the battle itself. The statue is not bolted to its foundation. It stands freely, held in place only by its own immense weight and the center of gravity. It balances on the hill, just as the Soviet Union balanced on the edge of the abyss in 1942. Underneath the hill, millions of bones still rest. It is said that the grass on Mamayev Kurgan is greener than anywhere else in Russia, fertilized by the blood of a generation. Stalingrad did not just change the map, it changed the military manual. Before 1942, armies tried to avoid cities. Cities were seen as obstacles to be bypassed. Stalingrad proved that the city is the battlefield of the future. The tactics developed by General Chuikov, the hugging of the enemy, the storm groups, the mouse-holing through walls, the sniper dominance, became the foundation of modern military operations on urban terrain. When American Marines fought in the streets of Hue City in Vietnam, or Fallujah in Iraq, they were using tactics written in blood in Stalingrad. When modern armies use drones to spot artillery in urban ruins, they are channeling the spirit of Zaitsev's spotters. Stalingrad taught the world that in a city, technology is secondary to grit. A tank is just a big target in a narrow street. A bomber is useless against a deep cellar. The ultimate weapon is a squad of infantry with grenades and shovels. So why did Germany lose? German generals, writing their memoirs after the war, loved to blame General Winter. They blamed the cold. They blamed Hitler's interference. They blamed the vastness of Russia. These are excuses. The truth is found in the factories. The Battle of Stalingrad was the collision of two industrial philosophies. Germany fought a rich man's war. Their tanks were jewels of engineering, but they were scarce. Their logistics relied on precision timing. When the train lines were cut, the army starved. They treated war as a specialized profession for the elite. The Soviet Union fought a total war. While the Germans were measuring tolerances in microns, the Soviets were churning out T-34s in factories where the workers were freezing to death. While the Luftwaffe struggled to find spare parts for their complex planes, the Soviet Warforge simply built more planes than the Germans had bullets. The Soviets understood that a good enough weapon that is available today is infinitely better than a perfect weapon that arrives tomorrow. At Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army fired millions of rounds. They killed hundreds of thousands of Soviets. Tactically, they were superior soldiers. But for every Soviet soldier who fell, the Volga ferries brought two more across the river. For every T-34 destroyed, the factories in the Urals built three more. Germany tried to fight a war of quality against an opponent who weaponized quantity. They tried to fight a mathematical war against a nation that accepted infinite sacrifice. In the end, the war of rats wasn't won by the rat. It was won by the forge that backed him. The ruins of Stalingrad stand as an eternal monument to the grim reality of industrial warfare. You can have the best soldiers, the best tactics, and the best uniforms. But if you cannot outproduce, outsupply, and outbleed your enemy, you will leave your bones in the snow.